Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. As the fire crackles behind the camera and the snow continues to gently drift down and the 0 degree temperatures outside, I have continued to read The Lord of the Rings. And uh, because we've been a little bit pinned down inside by such circumstances, I wound up reading a little bit more than I normally would, but I feel like I always say this at the beginning of each installment. I don't necessarily have that much to say in this one. So, this will cover the last part of the first constituent book, quote unquote, in the Two Towers. So, the rest of, quote unquote, book 5 from chapter 4, The Siege of Gondor, to the end. Chapter 10, I guess, The Black Gate opens. All right, so yeah, to begin with, I thought this was going to be a section that there wasn't a whole lot to say about. In the Siege of Gondor, I noticed that Faramir eats white bread specifically when he first comes home to Minas Tirith. I thought that was potentially because white bread was something of a luxury in medieval times, so I think that that's perhaps marking his status. Um, my eyes kept flipping back to the map. I mean, that's been more true of The Return of the King than any other of the books. Um, you hear about all these places that have never been mentioned before, Cair Andros and every other place. I thought that the interaction between Denethor and Gandalf made this an interesting chapter. Now, at this stage of reading the book, of course, I remembered the movies, which I've mostly seen with the Riff Tracks commentaries, so perhaps I haven't been the most attentive watcher of the movies per se. But I remember, that Denethor just kind of goes crazy at some point and throws himself, or he tries to burn Faramir on a funeral pyre, and he's going to burn himself on it too. And when he's thwarted by Gandalf and Pippin, he winds up jumping off of the tower in flames. And reading chapter 4 here, I thought, oh, that must have been made up by Peter Jackson, because the Denethor of this chapter seems pretty reasonable, right? He has differences with Gandalf, but it doesn't seem surprising that one would have differences with Gandalf, right? Oh, you had the greatest weapon, tool, however exactly it works, in your hands, and you put it in the hands of two hobbits and sent them into the land of the enemy, rather than just keep it here. Denethor isn't saying he would use it, but that he would keep it. Now, I think it's a reasonable difference of opinion within the magical fantasy world of Lord of the Rings, and Gandalf says, well, I don't trust you. It's kind of an interesting exchange. He says, quote, nonetheless, I do not trust you. Had I done so, I could have sent this thing hither to your keeping and spared myself and others much anguish. And now hearing you speak, I trust you less, no more than Boromir. Nay, stay your wrath. I do not trust myself in this, etc., etc. Off quote. So, Gandalf here is Epictetus, right? He's saying that he greets himself as a tiger on the road. And we get a lot of back and forth about if this, if that, and Denethor says, quote, if you had, such words and ifs are vain, off quote. So it strikes me as, again, a difference between reasonable parties within the fantasy circumstances, and I was surprised as the chapters went on, as Denethor got rapidly crazier. Gandalf says something about Aragorn that I thought sounded a little bit like a list of kingly virtues that you might find in Havamal or the King's Mirror or something like that from Old Norse literature. Quote, he is strong and stern underneath Pippin, bold, determined, able to take his own counsel and dare great risks at need, off quote. just struck me as something that seems culturally appropriate. There was some more archaic vocabulary and syntax, as there always is. Now and then a sentence would make me sort of eye roll at just how strangely it's put from a modern English perspective, like, quote, Gandalf it was that last spoke to Faramir ere he rode east, off quote. It was Gandalf that last spoke to Faramir before he rode east, right? Like, just say this in the way that anyone born since 1650 would say it. Denethor, just I don't know. In this chapter, I was sort of interested in him as a character. He's kind of a hashtag operator, right? He sleeps with his armor on and always has his sword on, which you don't really get the impression of him that way from the movies. He implies that Sauron has some kind of physical body because he will, quote, he will not come save only to triumph over me when all is won, off quote. So Sauron is more than just an eye in a tower. He's a guy who can move around. I mean, previously, I think Gollum said that he had fingers, 4 fingers on one hand. So that there's something physical to him, which you don't really get in the movies. More stuff that you just don't see in the movies. The houses and barns burn in the Pelenor fields. Again, it's a more lived-in place that has an economy as opposed to the tower that just seems to subsist on what, I don't know, making apps and Amazon deliveries maybe in the Peter Jackson movies. Speaking of which, Denethor said something that made me think he probably gets push notifications from his Palantir app. He says, quote, some have accused you, Mithrandir, of delighting to bear ill news, but to me this is no longer news. It was known to me ere nightfall yesterday, off quote. Yeah. It's like something somebody would say about Twitter 20 years ago. The description of the physicality of Minas Tirith is really like in the movie, it seems to be a sort of vaguely spiraling series of levels, but there's a much more complex picture of it here, and I kind of wished that there was a map of the levels, because actually as the siege goes on, you get more and more information about what's happening at the south end of this level or something like that, and I felt that it was sort of hard to picture, but I could tell that Tolkien had a picture, and I thought that perhaps a map of it would have been nice. He, I suppose, assumes that we have more knowledge of Elvish than we really have, with lines like, quote, Fen Holin it was called, for it was kept ever shut, off quote. I don't know what the for is, right? I don't know what Fen Holin means. We have Pippin called Denethor, quote, fey and dangerous, off quote. Of course, there's that fey word, doomed to die. In later English, especially in Tolkien here, it seems to also have a sense of meaning to die more than just doomed to die. When the Black Rider shows up below the city, we hear, behold, quote, behold, he had a kingly crown, and yet upon no head visible was it set, off quote. So he's invisible. That's interesting. That's actually a more striking image than I think the movies made it. I thought that his flaming blade reminded me a little bit of Surtur, right? The great enemy of the gods at Ragnarok in the Norse conception, especially in the poem Völuspá. And then I was reminded of Völuspá once again at the very end of the Siege of Gondor, when a cock crowed. Of course, 3 roosters. I'm going to use a term that doesn't make 10-year-olds laugh in 2025. 3 roosters crow in Völuspá as Ragnarok approaches. In chapter 5, the ride of the Rohirrim. Always when there's a little bit more stuff going on with the Rohirrim, I feel like there's more Old English to talk about. But there was also this whole interaction with the, quote, wild men and their leader, Khan Buri Khan, who sometimes is called Khan. So I assume that Buri means son of in their language, Khan, son of Khan, something like that. I had the impression that, if anything, what J.R.R. Tolkien had in mind here was something like the uh, the Comanche in a John Wayne movie. And at first, I thought, oh no, this is going to be really, really thin ice here. I didn't think that he would handle this very sensitively from a 2020s perspective. Um, but then he represents him as speaking sort of broken common speech or English, but his points are cogent. I mean, he's a strong and an intelligent character. I thought he even had one of the best lines in the book. Quote, "Dead men are not friends to living men, and give them no gifts," off quote. Right? If you die doing what you say you're going to do, it's not going to matter. If anything, initially I was thinking of the most unflattering image of American Indians in a John Wayne movie, but I eventually came back to thinking that this is perhaps a little bit like the more nuanced picture that you see in a film like The Searchers, right? I think of the great scene where John Wayne says, "You speak pretty good English for a Comanche," and the retort is, "You speak pretty good Comanche for a white man," or something like that. It was a little bit more eye to eye, and I thought that it was it was all right. I almost felt that the loss of these characters in the movie was an important one. They could have played a part. I mean, Peter Jackson made the extended editions of these movies like 4 hours long. How much? It doesn't seem like that much of a challenge to add these characters, and it adds some intrigue to the Rohirrim approach to Gondor. What else? Might one say Amer talks about an old saw, SAW, which is, quote, "Need brooks no delay, yet late is better than never," off quote. An old saw, of course, saws just means something said in older English. It's actually cognate with the word that becomes Icelandic saga, something said. I feel like this term old saw used to be a little bit more common. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone younger than 70 say that. The Rohirrim organize themselves into groups, each one of which is called an Eored. That would be horse council, the council of those on their horses, I suppose. One of them is named Weedfara. It would just mean wide traveling. That is, of course, something very nearly cognating in construction as a nickname. In Old Norse, we have Idar and Vidforle, for example, Ivar the wide traveling. We get a very very old English sounding command from Theoden toward his riders, quote, "Oaths ye have taken, now fulfill them all, to lord and land and league of friendship," off quote. First of all, this seems pretty close to alliterative poetry, lord, land, league. But of course, in something like Beowulf, one of the great tragedies toward the end is that all of the guys except Wiglaf, who have sworn Beowulf allegiance, abandon him at the end. But among the Rohirrim, they're all, the good Wiglafs who stay with their Beowulf, their Theoden toward the end. I note that he calls Éomer his son around here, and that men clash their spear upon shield to indicate assent. That's something we know of from at least the Norse. We have a guy named Grimbold, so like either literally Grimbold or it could be Bold Mask Bold, but a good old English name in any case. Consistently, the narrator and Mary himself call Eowyn here Dernhelm, so the name she takes in disguise reminded me a little bit of the saga of Hervor and Haedrek, translated by me in my fourth book, the Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, where she's consistently called Dernhelm, or she's consistently called Hervarther when she's in disguise as Hervarther, even though the narrator knows that it's Hervor. We get more Forne the Sog, or Old English style poetry. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden. We get, and in fact, in that stanza, we get this compound sword day, which again scratched my mind and reminded me a little bit of Volaspá, because in Volaspá we hear about this, the different the age that will come when men begin to fight their brothers. Skullmold, right? For example, it would be an age of the sword, an age of the shield, an age of the sword, an age of the axe. Skullmold, Skegold. So this is sword day rather than a sword age, but the compound definitely reminded me of that. We hear of Guthlof, so like battle survivor, good old English name, who's the standard bearer of Theoden. And they seem to go kind of berserker, berserker, right, once they enter into battle. So I thought that was another nod to their being basically imports from um, something like Beowulf or Norse Fornalder saga. Let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll come back and start with Chapter 6, The Battle of the Pelenor Fields. So, of course, this is a kind of an action chapter, but there are plenty of interesting things to comment on. We get a little bit more of a description of the beast ridden by the ring wraith, and I realized that as much as it had been described as being kind of a bird, that maybe he was using the semantic taxonomy of older or Middle English, where bird basically means anything that flies. I mean, if you think of the Old English word for bird, the word that becomes fowl, it's from the same root as fly, right? It just has metathesis. The L has wound up behind the G that used to be there, and that's why we wind up with fowl rather than flowl or something that would have been a little bit more obviously related to fly. But what he's describing actually seems to be like even more than the weird dragon thing of the movies. A pterosaur, which I suppose, I don't know where I put my reading glasses, but I would shake them at you to remind you that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. But as a fossil kid, I was, enjoying there being some kind of prehistoric animal, sort of by implication here. Oh, thank you so much. You don't wish to appear on camera, though. Yeah, all right. That was a firm no. Quote, "Behold, it was a winged creature, if bird, then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear. And its vast pinions were as webs or hide between horned fingers, and it stank. A creature of an older world, maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains, cold beneath the moon, outstayed their day, and in hideous eyrie bred this last untimely brood, apt to evil," off quote. Other than pterosaurs being apt to evil and stinking, I suppose, this does sound like, a Quetzalcoatlus or a Pteranodon or something, right? So that's kind of cool. Also, nice, just casual poetry there. Lingering in forgotten mountains, cold beneath the moon. Right? He doesn't need to say beneath the moon, but he throws it in just to make it more memorable and to alliterate probably with mountains. Eowyn calls the ring wraith that she fights. I always get a little bit. Oh man, this is going to get me 15 comments about what a moron I am. But I always feel like it's a little confusing in the narrative what Nazgul is referring to, whether it's the humanoid ring wraith or the pteranodon. By the way, pterodactyl is a genus of pterosaur, not a general name for the type of flying prehistoric reptile. She calls him a Dwemer-like, so Dwemer, that would be magic-like. I mean, it looks more like Gothic than Old English or Old Norse. Is that supposed to be the play word, like the play of ghostly magic or something like that? I'm not totally sure what he's meaning to suggest with this word. That AI diphthong isn't present in Old English. So it doesn't quite strike one as a Rohirric or Old English word. He fights her with a mace, not a mace and chain, which I seem to remember from the movie. Even though that looks, I think, a little bit more like a heavy metal album cover to people today, the mace strikes me as a more practical weapon than the mace and chain in this situation. So points to the book above the movie there, probably. I was pretty confused about what on earth the physicality of the ring wraith is here. I mean, he's invisible, but Merry's sword pierces, quote, the sinew behind his mighty knee, off quote. But then when Eowyn strikes him, quote, the mantle and hauberk were empty, off quote. That, like, is is he is he there or is he not there? Right? I didn't quite understand. Um, is he mostly not there, but hit him with the right thing and he's there? I was pretty confused about that. Uh, but maybe the confusion is part of the world building, right? The fact that he doesn't come right out and give you, the hit points and the, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, strength, dexterity, constitution of the thing is probably more intriguing than if he told you, like, yeah, the ring wraith is impervious to everything but swords of westerness and has a +3 mace or whatever, right? It's more interesting for being less detailed. I thought that Snowmane, the horse of Theoden, being described as, quote, the bane of his master was pretty real, as the kids might say. Um, I mean, look, it's dangerous to ride horses. How many people get injured on horses? I mean, I know a guy who is forever a vegetable for the rest of his life because he fell off a horse during a routine work ride, and his family is bereft and destitute. Right? I mean, like it is easy to get hurt on a horse, and I think that Tolkien, in having the king die on I mean, the horse didn't mean to kill him, but die on the battlefield. The last proximate cause of his death is his horse crushing him. Is Strikes me as someone who's pretty aware of horses, and something that a movie made even 25 years ago probably wouldn't dare to do because people have such a glittery pony image of horses now, but they're dangerous to be around. It doesn't mean don't be around them, but it just strikes me as very real, and I thought that was kind of a shame not to see moved into the movies. Theoden talks to Merry toward the end of his life. I guess right at the end of his life. He's the main protagonist, so he gets final words. He says, quote, I go to my father's, off quote. I think to people that sounds old fashioned, but it doesn't strike me as a particularly Old English or Old Norse notion. Yes, you see something like this in that famous prayer that Ibn Fadlan records from the roost that he meets around modern day Kazan, but it's not the kind of sentiment that I think is common to a narrative like Beowulf or the Volsung poems or the Saga of the Volsungs. It strikes me as more generically antique in phrasing than it does specifically Old English or Old Norse. Someone might challenge me on that, but that's how that sounds to me. And he mentions, I note, that he, quote, felled the black serpent, off quote. And for a moment I thought, wait, wasn't that Merry and Eowyn? But then I remembered, oh, that's a flag that he cut down of some of the men who were fighting under the flag of Mordor. Now, I think the movies probably overemphasize how many of the people in the army of Mordor are orcs versus humans. Again, whatever exactly the difference is. But the books make it pretty clear that a lot of the people fighting against Gondor and Rohan are just humans who were caught up in the sphere of influence of Mordor. And we get some snatches of their language. Apparently, Mumak is elephant. Mumakil seems to be the plural. Therefore, um, we get this much more prominent role for Dol Amroth and its prince in the book who are utterly absent from the movies, right? In the movies, there is a rule that the only thing that can come to save you at the last minute is an elf. But in the books, there's just much more complex interrelationship between different realms of human beings, and I find that more interesting. I guess I realized as I go through these books that I probably sound more and more negative about the movies. Um, I don't intend to sound that way. I mean, any given movie is the product of 2,000 people right? I'm not trying to make imprecations against the, everyone credited in these films, but I find that the end result is not quite I think as interesting as what's in the books. Also, I note that in the books, a lot of the lines given to Theoden in the movies are actually Eomer's. Eomer has this little snatch of Fornia the Slog poetry. He says, quote, "Mourn not over much. Mighty was the fallen. Meet was his ending. When his mound is raised, women then shall weep. War now calls us." Off quote. Very nice little snatch of Fornia the Slog. I also note that Eomer, as he goes through the dead on the battlefield, the Valdar in Old Norse, whale in English. Of course, it's the first element in Valhall, the hall of the men slain in battle, that he recalls their names. That struck me as being Old English in a way. I mean, right, in Beowulf, when someone falls, we know who he is. Beowulf knows who he is. Much more so than in I think in some classical poetry of war, my impression was always that, a lot of the kind of the non-protagonist characters like weren't worth naming, and I don't feel like that's the case in Old English, Old Norse, or in Tolkien. We also hear that a fey mood, quote unquote, took Eomer. So again, like a willingness to die, it seems like in Tolkien, beyond just being doomed to die. We get this whole. I'll just read this because I think this is all culturally interesting. After Eomer sees Eowyn, quote, "He spurred headlong back to the front of the great host and blew a horn and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice calling, 'Death, ride, ride to ruin and the world's ending.' And with that the host began to move, but the Rohirrim sang no more. 'Death,' they cried with one voice loud and terrible, and gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southwards." Off quote. So at this point, they that sort of frenzied joy of battle has passed from them, and now they are again sort of berserker. They're just intent on causing death, and of course earning their own deaths in battle. So that struck me as a very Norse junction for them. We have another named Rohirric man, Deorwinna, precious friend. Deor, of course, is an attested name in Old English, and we have lots of names with that Winna element, friend, like Baldwin, Edwin, etc. Bold friend, rich friend. We read about Snowmane's Hoe, Howe. Of course, that's the word cognate with Old Norse Haugr, Haugr, burial mound. No surprise that a horse would get one in this horse-loving culture. Eomer is quite the poet from an Old English perspective. He gives us another Fornia the Slog stanza, quote, "Out of doubt, out of dark, to the day is rising. I came singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall." Off quote. Perfect Fornia the Slog stanza from an Old Norse perspective. Good poetry from an Old English perspective too. I read it just because I think that it's so good from that perspective, and I at least know where to emphasize things. And I recall from reading his letters in middle school or something, always funny how I recall this stuff better than the fiction, that I think he hated American accents, so he probably wouldn't like how I read it, but I have at least some impression of the meter that he's going for. The narrator calls these staves. Of course, that's a very archaic use of that word for words, right? I mean, there are simpler words for these things. It occurred to me, when we get this whole long description of Aragorn and his titles, quote, "Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elisar, Isildur's heir," off quote, he's coming to Gondor to become its king, even though he's really descended, if I get this wrong, there'll be 30 comments about what a moron I am, but he's really descended from the king from the northern side of this, right, from Arnor. So it struck me as almost like a Roman fantasy, right? The empire has fallen after being split into two. Only Minas Tirith, which reminds me a lot of Byzantium, are Constantinople. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. Um, only this preserves some of the glory of the ancient days, but the emperor has fallen in Constantinople, and now, and we need a descendant of the last emperor in the West. Wasn't his name Romulus Augustulus? He must come forth and ride into Constantinople and lead them against uh, the enemies of Christendom and a new united Christendom or something like that. Like, obviously, that's not exactly what's going on here, but that parallel strikes me as something that I suppose somebody who really liked ancient Rome might might fantasize about. I don't know why that didn't occur to me before. The parallel between the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire in this story, but there it is. We hear that some of the humans who are fighting against Gondor are, quote, Varyogs. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but of course I couldn't help but think of the word Varangian, used for so many of the Norse in where else but Constantinople, although of course they were allies to Constantinople, not enemies. We hear that the Dunedain are, quote, doer-handed, off quote. I had never heard that expression. I was surprised to see it. Also, it occurs to me that probably most people say dour, not doer, but I think at least that's what one would say, and I'm pretty sure that some of my grandparents said it. Anyway, I feel that some of the enemies of Gondor here are praised a little bit, right? They are, quote, fierce and despair, off quote, and that's exactly what the Rohirrim are. So, a little bit of appreciation for one's enemies, which strikes me as characteristic of Norse poetry and narratives. Grimbold, we hear, will never return to Grimslada. I couldn't think of exactly what that would mean. But I thought that it was interesting. This chapter ends in a long poem in what, from an Old Norse perspective, is Fornithasag, and we are told that it is attributed to a, quote, maker, off quote. And of course, in Old English, that's exactly what a poet is called, right? A poet is a shaper. So I thought that was an interesting little shout out. Theoden is called a Thengling in that poem. That would, of course, mean descendant of Thengel, which I think is his father, given that he's called Theoden, son of Thengel, like 50 times. We get a bunch of Old English names here. We get Harding. Really looks almost more like an Old Norse name. Guthlaf, Dunhera, Theorwina, Grimbold, Herafara. Herafara would be like army traveler. Herubrand, sword, torch, or sword. Heru is a very archaic word for sword in Old English. You see it a little bit more in Old Norse as Hjor. Fostred, so like firm, counsel, firm in counsel. All right. It's probably the chapter I have the most to say about here. We get to the chapter called The Pyre of Denethor, where I don't know why the most interesting characters to me so far have been Faramir and Denethor, but I don't know. I pay more attention when either one is on the page. Maybe I sort of enjoy their super pretentious Shakespearean English and interesting characters. But as Denethor prepares to burn himself, Gandalf admonishes him, saying, quote, only the heathen kings under the domination of the dark power did thus, slaying themselves in pride and despair, murdering their kin to ease their own death, off quote. I thought, what does heathen mean in Middle Earth? Right? I mean, is Gandalf, Sanctus Gandalfus here, who's, admonishing the heathen Gondorics to join under the banner of heaven? It's just an interesting term to see here. Again, interesting chapter. Just not much for me to say from an Old Norse or Old English perspective. And it ends in a nice little cinematic note. More cinematic, really, than the cinema was. Speaking of Gandalf and Pippin, quote, even as they hastened on their way, the wind brought a gray rain, and all the fires sank, and there arose a great smoke before them, off quote. Wouldn't take a lot of special effects to do that, but it would be more cinematic than most of what was in the movie. Speaking of the movie, which I grow increasingly critical of as I go through this. We hear of the, quote, valiant archers of Morthond, off quote. Where are they? The only one shooting arrows, it seems like, in the movies is Legolas. But I thought that as we get into the Houses of Healing that, exactly who Gandalf is and what he's here to do somewhat unclear to me. I mean, we hear that, quote, while the great battle outside went on with shifting hopes and strange tidings, and still Gandalf waited and watched and did not go forth, off quote. I think Faramir is cool, but he's spending all of his time waiting by Faramir's bedside and not helping the battle outside. A wizard in a D&D sense would be out, casting lightning bolts or something, right? What is he doing, right? I know there's got to be some answer that the Tolkien stand could give me, but it as a naive reader, I'm not very sure. I thought that the healer called Eoreth being called, quote, an old wife, off quote, struck me as a kind of Old English or Old Norse sense of that term, right? Just meaning old woman. She's not, we don't meet who her husband is, but just wife in the sense of woman struck me as very Old English, Old Norse, more Old English than anything. This chapter actually manages to be kind of funny with the interactions between Aragorn and Gandalf and Eoreth, and how she just wants to talk, and they just want her to get stuff. But then I thought that probably the funniest thing in the whole book so far was the quote herb master, which, if J.R.R. Tolkien were Stan Lee and were alive in the early 2000s, this would have been his cameo as this character, right? Quote, thereupon the herb master entered. Your lordship asked for Kingsfoil, as the rustics name it, he said, or Athalas in the noble tongue, or to those who know somewhat of the Valinorian. I do so, said Aragorn, and I care not whether you now say Asea Aranion or Kingsfoil, so long as you have some. Your pardon, lord, said the man. I see you are a lore master, not merely a captain of war, off quote. So, this would be J.R.R. Tolkien's cameo, right? Playing the guy who cares about telling you the name of everything. And then we get even more of that later when Aragorn is talking to the hobbits. He mentions the herb master and says, quote, he will leave you to reflect on the history of tongues, quote. So I feel like this is kind of self-aware self-insert by J.R.R. Tolkien. Right? I mean, this would be his self-loving Stan Lee cameo. And it's too bad he didn't live to do it, although I suspect he would have been pretty bitter about this being filmed in the first place. Much is made of how fair, quote unquote, Legolas is and Imrahil is because he's part elf, and all of that made me uncertain what exactly I was supposed to be picturing. Again, I do not think it is clear at all what the hell an elf is, other than a person who lives a long time and can walk on top of snow, right? Like, this is not me saying J.R.R. Tolkien's a bad writer. It's part of his art, and just sort of pretending that right, and not giving you the intelligence, constitution, charisma, whatever of everything. But it is remarkably unclear what the hell an elf is. And I think that that's it's sort of remarkable that you go through this whole book and never really get a picture of it. And so much of this story is so much more complex. And again, there's so many different peoples of different areas moving. It's so much more than just elves and dead guys fighting orcs. There was a stanza that reminded me a little bit of one in Havamal, probably about 100 stanzas in. Odin advises one should not put too much trust in the weather nor in the sun too soon, because one should not put too much trust in the field nor in the sun too soon, because weather rules the field and whim rules the sun. Gandalf says something very similar. Quote, it is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule, off quote. I mean, very similar in sentiment, probably the most Odinic thing that Gandalf really says. And as we get into the setup for the battle at the gates of Mordor, set up to be much more of a climax than in the movies. Not much Old Norse and Old English stuff to say here, although the world building is really good. The character at the mouth of Sauron is much more interesting than in the movie. In the movie, I guess he's kind of just another monster, but here he's Numenorian. If that actually means what it seems to literally mean, that would make him thousands of years old or something, right? But he would then essentially be a relative of Faramir or Aragorn. That's interesting, right? To take a normal-ish human, perhaps made immortal by dark magics, in this role than some monster guy. He also talks curiously. He begins talking very archaically, right? Quote, "Thou art the spokesman," off quote. Eventually, he begins to speak more contemporarily, saying "you." So I don't know. I guess he's slowly adjusting his speech to the speech of the people he's speaking to, but maybe he's just doesn't speak common enough behind the gates of Mordor, so he's still speaking it in the way that he remembers from hundreds of years ago when he was younger or something like that. We actually get a description of trolls here, so actually I can picture a troll now, just like I can picture an ent. I still can't picture a goddamn elf or a dwarf, right? But I think that's interesting that we really don't get pictures of these things. And then last, I noted the quote, "written blade of Westernesse," off quote, that Pippin wields, which has, quote, "the flowing characters of Numenor," off quote, upon it. So I'd forgotten that it's a one in Dungeons and Dragons terms or something would be a rune sword, right? It has letters on it, and some alphabet. I assume something like Tangwar, if that's flowing characters. Although I don't know why that would be called flowing characters of Numenor. Well, that's a video about twice as long maybe as the average of these, but I covered a lot of territory. Again, most of the Old English and Old Norse stuff there is to say has to do with poetry and names anymore. Although at least this first half of the Return of the King has been good for just holding the reader's interest. Pretty action-packed, great characters. There's almost that sort of, and I'm sure this makes me a basic naive moron, but a little bit of a sigh, like, oh boy, now I have to go back to Frodo and Sam, whining and crawling through the sand. Like, it was much more interesting listening to, Gimli and Legolas snipe at each other and Aragorn and Gandalf do cool sword stuff. But I'm sure it'll be good too. Anyway, thanks to those of you out there taking a look at this crowdfunding project that I'm going to start funding in February to do something I think J.R.R. Tolkien would have approved of, which is putting the Poetic Edda into runes. Take a look at that if you haven't yet. Thanks to my Patreon supporters for allowing me the privilege of making a living this way, talking to you about Old Norse stuff in video format from some of the world's most beautiful places, far hand and near hand, and from beautiful Colorado. Inside on this bitterly cold day, I'm wishing you and Tolkien fans everywhere all the best.